In episode number 95, we'll talk about leveraging online spaces for educational purposes. Hello and welcome to In the Classroom, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. My name is Benjamin Stewart at benjaminlstewart.org, and today is January 14th, 2022. Before we get into today's topic, if you have any thoughts, insights, or opinions on today's topic, feel free to reach out to me at my Twitter handle at BNLEEZ. I am currently undergoing some changes with my website and the domain name. So for some reason at the time of this recording, if you're not able to access the webpage, it's for that reason. I'll include a direct link to the newsletter in the description of this podcast if you want to refer to the show notes for today's broadcast. Today I want to talk about leveraging online spaces, and today's really a continuation of really discussing the podcast that I've been creating over the last few years. I'm currently taking a course on podcasting and really using my own podcasting experience as kind of a way to reflect on really the purpose, how I go about creating it, reflecting a little bit more on the organization and the purpose, and seeing how I can go about improving the podcast and how I can maybe reach my students using this platform, along with some other online spaces that I want to talk about here today. In the show notes, I've linked the prior episode number 94, where I talk about the why of the podcast, the purpose, and a little bit about the how, some of the gear that I'm using. So if you're interested in knowing more about the podcast in terms of gear and the overall purpose, feel free to check out the prior episode. In today's episode, I want to talk about leveraging online spaces, and I've been reflecting a lot over the last few days about how I can streamline my podcast and other online spaces that really help complement some of the way in which I go about creating content for my learners. My learners are pre-service and in-service English language teacher trainers. They are studying a bachelor's program to be English language instructors. And I've been using over the last few years podcasting as a way to deliver some of the content for some of the courses that I'm teaching. But what I'd like to talk about today really is 3 different online spaces, trying to again, simplify the spaces that I use and really limit it to 3. The podcast that you're listening to here today, I am starting a newsletter as a way to provide show notes for the episode, and also a newsletter for just non-podcasting situations. So I'm going to be using Substack, and I'll include the link to the Substack where you can find not only the show notes for this episode, but other posts as well if you're interested. If it's something that you would like to receive directly in your inbox, feel free to subscribe. But I am going to be implementing Substack along with the podcast and also my YouTube channel. So much of the content that I share and prepare and deliver in the courses that I teach will really fall into one of those 3 categories, and sometimes a combination of those. Okay, so it'll be in text form. That'll be now in the form of a newsletter. If it's just audio only and there's really no visual component that's really necessary, then podcasts will be used. And of course, when there are times where a video is required, then that's when I'll be bringing in the YouTube channel. But the show notes, the newsletter will link to either the video or the audio, if there is one that goes with the text. There might be times where I just produce a newsletter with no audio or video. But again, trying to find ways to simplify this. If you refer back to the prior episode where I talk about the purpose of the podcast, It really is many. It could be related to content that's related to certain topics that students are thinking critically about. Maybe they're doing a performance task that requires some kind of background information or knowledge about a particular topic. It could also be, of course, linguistic in nature, so maybe it's related to declarative knowledge about certain grammatical aspects. It could also be the content that I produce in the podcast and or the video and or the newsletter could also be related to helping learners with certain technologies. Maybe it's something that they don't have a lot of experience with, so a lot of the content that I create will be to help assist them become more familiar with certain technologies so that they can use that technology to participate in the performance and the activity. So the podcast, the show notes, the newsletter, and the YouTube channel primarily are going to be the online spaces that I'll be using to deliver most of the content with my learners. Now, I also will be using Twitter, and I use Twitter a lot to push a lot of the content that I create for my students out publicly. The Twitter profile and really the as far as my students are concerned, so far I haven't really used Twitter for my own teaching practice. It's more just as a social media site that I use for sharing a lot of what I do in my class publicly. So the Twitter space is also used in addition to the podcast, in addition to the newsletter and the YouTube channel. But again, for the purposes of my teaching practice, the Twitter at this point hasn't been used all that much. Now, the last component of really the activity that I want to share with you and today in this podcast, in addition to talking about leveraging these 3 online spaces, is just the overall organization of the podcast. Again, this is part of some of the activities we've been working on and thinking about and discussing with my colleagues, and the course that I'm taking on podcasting is the overall structure. And over I would say the last year or so, I've been fairly consistent in the way in which I go about organizing the information for each of the podcasts. Typically, the intro will include kind of a teaser at the beginning, and then the background music where I provide the name of the podcast, the slogan. I mention my name and also certain social media. So before I get into each of the topics, I typically will present those as a kind of intro. And then typically I'll have an outline of 3 to 4 key points that I want to talk about. I usually try to limit the points to no more than 4. And usually we'll have just a little bit of information there written out in the show notes so that as much as possible, the information that I include in my podcast is as spontaneous as possible. There are times where I'll be reading certain pieces of information. In fact, I believe the prior episode I was reading a little bit more than I usually do in terms of listing out the different gear that I am currently using to produce the podcast, and that was only so that I didn't leave anything out. So probably the prior episode is an exception to most of the podcasts that you've heard. Again, most of them are fairly spontaneous, for better or for worse. I think there's something that to be said for those podcasts that have the text written out, the script is written out, and they're delivering that. But so far, most of the podcasts that I've created have been more spontaneous in nature. So today, basically, I just wanted to share with you the online spaces that I'm currently using. Again, trying to simplify my workflow, trying to really get to the content, trying to find the best way to deliver it, whether it's audio only, audio and video, or text. And then based on whatever it is that I am sharing, that I am creating, primarily for my students, then we'll make a decision about the online spaces or the combination of online spaces that will best serve that particular purpose. Now, I will say, as I mentioned in the prior episode number 94, where I talk about the why of my podcast, one of the purposes is simply to reach out to other colleagues beyond those that I work with face-to-face. And so, again, that's where the Twitter space helps, and I also use that to push out information publicly. I'm not mentioning Office 365, which is an account that we have, our students have, and we use Microsoft Teams quite a bit. So that's a huge part of some of the other online spaces that students are using that have classes with me. But generally speaking, Office 365 is more of a closed situation. It's more of a private space where students and I are interacting in the courses. So that's why I'm not mentioning it here. The online spaces that I'm discussing today primarily are public, and in fact, all the information that's being shared is made freely available and open to the public. And again, being podcast, newsletter, and a YouTube channel. So if you have any thoughts, if you are currently using podcast in your own teaching practice, I'd be curious to know how you're going about doing it, some of the gear that you're using, your workflows, some of the online spaces that you're using and leveraging and bringing those together to help deliver the content to your students. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to contact me at my Twitter handle at BNLEEZ. I'll leave the show notes or the link to the show notes in the description of this episode if you also want to leave comments there as well. This has been In the Classroom, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. Thanks for listening.